This is a long overdue foundational episode that's going to help you to make a distinction between relative and absolute truth, to understand what these two types of truth are, which turns out to be very, very important, because failure to make this distinction leads to all sorts of traps and conflations, which we'll get into the second half of this episode. This episode is very much geared towards opening your mind to the possibility of the existence and your personal access to absolute truth, that such a thing is even possible. So this episode connects with previous episodes that I've recorded, one called Understanding Relativism Part 1. There's also going to be a Part 2, which I haven't released yet, so stay tuned for that. That will also be relevant, but this is not Part 2. This is its own thing, this episode. Another episode I recorded called What is Truth? That's a very powerful one. Make sure you go watch that. And another one I recorded called How to Discover What's True. That's also an extremely powerful one. Oftentimes I get people asking on the forum, in the comment section, but Leo, how do I know what's really true? How do I discover the truth for myself if I'm not just going to be adopting beliefs and dogmas? Well, that's why I recorded that episode. Go watch it. It's a very powerful episode. That episode will change your whole life. It'll change your entire epistemology if you do what's in that episode. But I won't repeat myself here. There's another episode I recorded called What is Actuality? It's kind of weirdly titled. That also helps to point you to truth. But anyways, before we can even point you to truth, we first have to open your mind to the possibility of the existence of absolute truth. And as simple as that is, you would think, the reality is that most people are simply not open to the possibility of absolute truth or to their ability to access it. So here's my question to you, very honestly right now. Don't repeat what you've heard others say, but just honestly, how do you feel? What is your belief? Do you believe there exists an absolute truth? And if it does, do you believe you can access it? Be honest. For the majority of people, the answer is no. And the reason is because a lot of the narratives we've been growing up with in our culture in the 21st century have been permeated by notions of relativism and also by materialism, which cast doubt on the existence and the possibility of accessing absolute truth. So there's sort of two levels to it. The first level is that you might say, well, okay, maybe there is an absolute truth, but how can we really know? Who's to really say? And even if it exists out there somewhere, how could a mere human, access it? Because after all, humans, we have this veil of perception. We're living in our own little bubbles of, whatever our minds are constructing. And, our mind is just, spinning a kind of reality for us that we need to survive as a sort of a biological survival machine. That's what evolution tells us. That's what evolutionary biology and psychology might tell us and so forth. So how can we really trust the human senses? And after all, there's so much outside of the human senses. There's ultraviolet light, there's infrared light, there's microwave radiation, there's all sorts of X-rays and gamma rays and dark matter and this and that and stuff that only our telescopes and instruments can see. Science shows us clearly that we only see this much of the visible, of the light spectrum, of electromagnetic spectrum. We only see this little sliver of it. There's all this stuff outside of it. And because of this, the absolute truth must, even if it exists, must be out there somewhere for somebody else to discover, but not for humans. Right? See, this is the kind of narrative that you've been fed. Or you might be so deep into relativity and relativism, and maybe even because of the things you've heard me say in the past, because I talk about relativity very deeply. It's a very profound concept that most people don't appreciate. But, thanks to postmodernism and so forth, relativism has creeped into all aspects of our culture to a certain degree. And so you might actually, your worldview might actually hold that there is no absolute truth, All that there are sort of interpretations, versions, perspectives, subjectivity, and nothing else. And that's the nature of existence. And in fact, in a recent episode I released on how your mind interprets reality, I started with a quote. I started that episode with a quote from Nietzsche. I love this quote. The quote is, what is it? It's there are no facts. There are only interpretations. All right. So you might have seen that quote, heard that quote, and then you might have taken that to mean that, well, then there is no absolute truth. It's all just interpretations. Leo, isn't that what that episode was all about? Why did you use that quote? Well, you see, as I warned you at the end of that episode, I warned you that you have to be very careful about how you interpret everything I say. And that quote in that episode wasn't meant to be taken literally. It was presenting you with a perspective, a partial perspective. In that episode, we were focused on interpretation. That does not mean that interpretation is all that there is. You see, you might have interpreted it that way, but again, that's just an interpretation. That doesn't make it absolutely true. So anyways, your worldview might simply not have any room for absolute truth. After all, you haven't experienced it yourself. Let's assume you haven't. Otherwise, what's the point of watching this? So if you haven't, then from your point of view, when I talk about absolute truth, I could be lying, I could be deluded, I could be hallucinating, I could be fantasizing, I could have a financial motive, I could be building a cult, whatever. You don't know what my situation is. I could simply be mistaken, as far as you know. So you would need some way to access the absolute truth for yourself to verify it, if such a thing exists. Or maybe it doesn't. Again, from your point of view, it could be either or. But the problem I want to address now is I'm not trying to get you to believe in the absolute truth here. I'm merely trying to open your mind, just even to the possibility that you might one day be able to access it. That's all I'm trying to do here. See, we're belaboring this point, but that's because most people's minds are not really open to the possibility of absolute truth, and it's a very radical possibility. So what do I mean when I'm asking you to open your mind to the possibility of absolute truth? I mean, you can absolutely know what reality is as a whole, absolutely. Absolutely what it is. That means there's no doubt. There's no possibility for error. You cannot be mistaken about absolute truth because it's absolute. By definition. It's absolutely true. It's true under all circumstances, as opposed to relative truth. So here we're going to start to make a distinction between absolute and relative. So what do we mean by relative? Well, most of the truths that human beings speak of when we say, oh, that's true, this is true, we use the word true and the concept true a lot throughout every daily life. I might ask you, like, did you have lunch today? And you might say, yes, I did. And then we might say, you're lying. That's false. Or we might say, he was telling the truth. So these are relative truths, these sort of human kinds of truths. But it's not merely about you having lunch or not. I mean, this extends into pretty much every human endeavor. So for example, when you say the sky is blue, you might say, well, is that a relative truth or is that an absolute truth? It's a relative truth. Why is it a relative truth? Because, and this is not so hard to understand, you see, the sky is blue is true if we assume certain contexts and other things that qualify that statement and make it very limited. So, for example, the sky is blue to a human being, we might say. To a different animal that doesn't see color, the sky is not blue. the sky is blue on Earth, but that does not mean the sky is blue on Mars. Because sky itself is a relative term. Which sky are you talking about? Usually when we just say sky, we're sort of implicitly referring to the Earth's sky, but sky is a more broad term than just the Earth. And then, the sky is blue when? At certain times in the day. The sky is not blue at night. The sky is not blue when there's a sunset or a sunrise. It's more orange. The sky is not blue when there's a lot of cloud cover. It's gray. And then if you have some sort of neurological defects, there's all sorts of people out there. There's colorblind people. There's people with weird mental conditions and genetics and stuff. To them, the sky might not be blue. It might be a different color. Right? So this simplistic notion that the sky is blue, ordinarily we take it as an objective fact, but really it's not an objective fact. It's only a fact when you really qualify it in many, many ways. And even then, it can break down in so many different ways, you see. Another way to illustrate relativity, and I've gone, by the way, through many of these examples in my Understanding Relativity Part 1 episode. Go watch that for more examples. But just a few more here just to get us grounded and to draw this distinction between relative and absolute is like velocity, right? So right now, you are supposedly sitting there listening to me, watching this, and you're sitting there. What's your velocity? You're sitting there still, pretty still, right? You're probably not running around as you're listening to me. Maybe you're out for a jog, in which case you have a certain velocity. But it's a pretty slow velocity. I mean, what are you jogging? 10 miles an hour at most? 5 miles an hour, something like that. Maybe you're in your car, in which case your velocity is faster. You're going 60 miles an hour, 80 miles an hour, something like that. But this is almost zero compared to the cosmic scale of what velocities are. And of course, as we know from physics and as we know from Einstein and so forth, velocity is relative. So if you're sitting there stationary listening to me, let's assume you're just sitting at home in a chair, you're not in your car, you might say your velocity is zero. And you might say Leo's velocity is also zero. He's just sitting here right now at home recording this. Okay. But that's not an absolute velocity. That's a relative velocity. Relative to what? Relative to the Earth. Because relative to the sun, the velocity of you just sitting there is not zero. The velocity of you relative to the sun is like hundreds of miles per second as the Earth is flying through space. And then we can expand beyond that and we could say your velocity relative to like the center of the Milky Way galaxy is even orders of magnitude faster than that because the sun itself is hurling through space even faster than the Earth is hurling around the sun, around the center of the Milky Way galaxy. And then the Milky Way galaxy itself is hurtling through space around the center of something else. And so it's sort of this nested hierarchy. And so what's your true velocity? You might say, what is our absolute velocity? Well, the answer is, of course, that there is no such thing because velocity itself is a relativistic notion. Ordinarily, because the relativity to us isn't very useful in everyday life, we talk about velocities as though they're absolute. But really, we're talking about them within a very narrow, limited frame. It happens that our frame here usually is just on this planet. Since our frame is confined to this planet, we can talk about a car going 60 miles an hour or whatever and sort of agree upon it, and it kind of works. But it's very limited, and it's not true in any absolute sense. It's purely relative. And this is, of course, what Einstein's special and general relativity started to point towards, is that there's no such thing as an absolute velocity. That concept itself doesn't make sense. Velocity itself is a relative concept. Now, you might wonder, why is that? Why is velocity relative? Well, velocity is relative because here's the deep intuition behind relative truths, is that a relative truth, what it's really doing is it's comparing two aspects of reality. If we assume for a moment just that reality is one giant singular thing, what you can do with that thing is you can take two parts of that thing and compare them against each other and then come up with some kind of truth about the relationship between those two parts. So for example, to say that something is large or small, what do you have to do? You can't really say that reality as a whole, taken as a whole, is small or large, because to say something is small or large, those concepts themselves are relativistic concepts. They require a second or an other against which you can compare and contrast that and either notice a difference or a similarity and a degree of difference. So you can't do that with a single object. A single object isolated by itself, you can't actually tell how big it is. So scale is actually a relativistic notion. So believe it or not, if you take the entire universe and you ask the question, is it big or is it small? You can't actually say which it is. Most people think the universe is big, but the reason you think that is merely because you are comparing it to yourself from your point of view as someone inside of it, and therefore to you it seems big. But that's relative. Because again, your point of view is just this little ant inside of this giant snow globe. But if you were sitting outside of the universe, so to speak, if you could imagine such a thing, which really isn't possible, but let's say it could be, then you actually couldn't say whether the universe was big or small because there would be nothing else with which to compare it against. Now you might say, well, there could be a second universe. Well, this is sort of a flimsy notion of universe. When I say universe, I'm talking about universe with a capital U. That means a universe that includes all possible multiverses too. So if you want to go with the multiverse theory, yes, you could compare our little, let's say, local universe with some other multiverse, some other universe from a multiverse. You could do those comparisons and you can compare sizes, but then we can take the entire multiverse and ask the question, is it big or small? And again, the answer is going to be, you can't say unless you have another multiverse with which to compare it against. You see how this works? So literally what relative truth is that we have to take a unified whole, we have to divide it at least in two parts or more, usually more, but at least two, and then we can compare these two parts. So we can say that an elephant is large and a mouse is small. Relative to what? Relative to our position in the hierarchy of different animals. Relative to humans, an elephant is large, it's bigger than us, and relative to humans, a mouse is small. Again, relative to us. But if you just take a mouse or an elephant isolated by itself without anything else as context, you actually can't say whether an elephant is large or small. Likewise for a mouse. And in fact, something even weirder is going to happen is you'll realize that the mouse and the elephant are actually exactly the same scale. If you take them isolated. If you put them next to each other, now you've got scale. Literally, scale doesn't exist, is what I'm telling you. Other than as a relative notion. So anyways, that's a bit of a mindfuck to realize when you realize that. It's one of those little sort of facets of awakening that you can grab as you're doing this work. But anyways, back to the notion of velocity. You see, the reason velocity is relativistic is because what is velocity? Velocity, as you've learned in physics class, is distance over time. But what is distance? And what is time? Well, distance is the thing that a yardstick measures. And how does a yardstick measure distance? It has little notches on it, little marks. Each one of those marks, whether it's an inch or a millimeter, whatever, yardstick, meter stick, doesn't matter. Whatever units you're using, you see, a unit is a division within the universe. So literally, inches on a yardstick are divisions that the human mind constructed. Thanks to these divisions, now we can say that, oh, so-and-so is 2 yards tall, or such and such is 100 yards long, or I'm traveling at a certain velocity because the velocity is yards per minute, or yards per second, or whatever, meters, miles. And that's only possible because, see, to compare how tall I am to how tall you are, we have to use a yardstick to measure by dividing me into little parts and dividing you into little parts, then counting up those parts, stacking them next to each other. And in so doing, see, we're doing a relative activity. And then if we do all that, we come up with a relative answer. And the relative answer, assuming we all agree upon the yardsticks and the methodology and all these other metaphysical and epistemic axioms that come along with doing this, various linguistic conceptual ideas, as long as we agree on these frameworks and such, we can then come to some sort of consensus relative truth. And we could say, well, so-and-so is 2 yards tall and so-and-so is 1.5 yards tall, or whatever. Do you see how that's relative? It's relative to a lot of stuff. It's relative to the units we're using, the kind of measurements we're doing, our methodology for collecting the measurements and doing the measurements, our methodology for interpreting the measurements, comparing the measurements. That's relative. If you change any of those things, the truth will actually break in this case. It will cease to be true. It's only true under all those conditions and assumptions. And then what is time? Because we were talking about velocity. That's just distance. What about time? What is time anyways? Well, that's an episode for another day. There's some profound things to say about time, but how do scientists define time? You know how Einstein defined time? Actually, I loved his definition because it was so brutally honest about the nature of what science is doing when it's measuring things. Einstein was very sneaky. He was very clever. And scientists in general are very clever to avoid metaphysics because they have to, because metaphysics is in the domain of the absolute. And what science is doing is always in the domain of the relative because it's always measuring and comparing things, dividing reality. So Einstein said that time is just the thing that a clock measures. That's literally his definition of time. The thing that the hand moving on the face of a clock is measuring. It's an ingeniously sneaky way to define what time is, because you're defining time and at the same time you're not saying anything about what the nature of time is. This allows you to do calculations with time without getting to the metaphysics of what time is. This is what all of science is predicated upon, is doing this at the very basic level. So any fundamental unit of science, whether it's going to be a meter or a gram or a calorie or a second of time or a hertz or a whatever of the most elemental unit of science, it might be an atom, it might be a joule of energy, and so forth. If you ask a scientist what actually is that thing, the scientist will not be able to tell you what that thing is, because the scientist simply doesn't know. And in fact, they're going to have a very sneaky way of excusing their not knowing of it by telling you that it's actually not even possible to know, nor is it important to know. All we really care about is just comparing the differences between these units, but we don't actually ever know what a unit is. So for example, no scientist knows what a meter is. They just know how to measure a meter and how to compare meters. Likewise, no scientist actually knows what a joule of energy is, but they know how to compare them and measure them. So they can tell you that there's 10 joules of energy in that object over there, and there's 20 over here, and the difference between them is 10, because what they can measure is the difference, but they can't tell you what a joule of energy actually is, and so on for every other physical unit. It's pretty scandalous when you actually discover this about the nature of science. But anyways, we're getting off track. So back to the clock and to time. So what is time? Einstein said it's just the movement of the hand across the face of the clock. But again, what is that? What is the movement of the hand? The clock face is also divided into units. So again, the velocity at which, you see, there, time is also in a sense being defined as a velocity because it's how many subdivisions of a circle is being swept across over a certain period of time, in a certain sense. See? So it becomes very strange, loopy, and kind of twisted and paradoxical here. But this is not a bug. This is a feature of how things work, because it's all entangled. But anyways, the bottom line, the point I'm trying to make here is that time itself is a relative notion. Why is time a relative notion? Because literally you have to subdivide one reality into parts and then start counting and measuring those parts. Those parts are measured in relation to each other, and then you can combine those different parts in different ways, creating different kinds of relationships, which gives you things like velocity, acceleration, and so forth. You can have first order, second order, third order comparisons, and this gives us various kinds of scientific truths. All these truths are relative. They're not absolute. So we have that on the one hand. Also, as we're talking about relative truths, we're talking about all human cultural truths, all truths of human cultures, religions, norms, moral systems, what kind of food is best, whether murder is wrong or not, whether slavery is wrong, or all of this. This is all relative truth. Any truth your mind comes up with is going to be a relative truth. Anytime you subdivide reality into two or more parts and then compare those parts and derive a truth based upon that comparison, that's going to be a relative truth. Just that right there, I'm pausing because that right there for many of you will be difficult to swallow. A lot of you will object to that and say, no, Leo, you're wrong. I don't really have time to go into that. I go into that more in my series about understanding relativism. This episode is not really about explaining relativity. We have other bigger fish to fry. We just needed to present that as a backdrop now, as, again, something to compare and contrast with absolute truth. So then what is absolute truth? Well, you see, the absolute truth is something that's fundamentally different in nature than relative truth. It's so different that our minds struggle to think about it, because our minds are used to operating within the domain of relative truth. Everything pretty much that you've called truth in your life has been in the relative domain. I want you to understand that. It's all been based on comparisons and subdivisions of reality into parts. And the point there is that has trained your mind from birth into a sort of dualistic, relative base of experience for how truth works. You think that all truth must work this way because that's the kind of truth you've been dealing with your whole life. But what I'm trying to show you is that open your mind to the possibility of a different domain of truth, which does not work in that way, and the mechanics of truth that operate in the relative domain do not apply and do not work at the absolute domain. And the fundamental difference here is that whereas in the relative domain, because you're subdividing reality with your mind, you can then make comparisons of one thing to another thing because one thing always has some opposite. You're operating dualistically. See my series, 3-part series called Understanding Duality, Part 1, Part 2, Part 3, to really get a deep handle on duality. And then absolute truth is operating in the non-dual domain. What does that mean? That means absolute truth is that which reality is before your mind subdivides it in any way. It's singular. It has no opposite. That means you can't compare it against anything else. So you can't, let's say just for a second, just assume that absolute truth exists and it's just like a question mark or the variable x. Let's call it x for now. Whatever this x is, you don't know what it is. But let's just assume that there is this x. this X, you might ask, well, Leo, so tell me about this X. I want to know, is this X big or small? Is it skinny or is it fat? Is it colorful or is it got no color? Is it beautiful or is it ugly? Is it good or is it bad? Is it going to help my life or is it going to hurt my life? Am I going to like it or am I going to hate it? Can I use it to earn money? Can I use it to get sex? How many meters wide is it? How many joules of energy does it have in it? How many seconds of time does it exist for? See, you might want to bring all of these questions to this variable X. But what you have to realize is that these are questions and features that are coming from the relative domain of comparisons and divisions. And as soon as you bring those ideas and assumptions to the non-dual domain of absolute truth, you immediately break the absolute truth because you subdivide it with your mind by asking those questions, and then it falls into and is brought into the relative domain by your mind. You see, so that's the trick that you have to be very careful of here, because if you do that without being aware that you're doing it, like for example, if you insist on asking me, Leo, is the absolute truth big or small? And you just keep asking and asking and asking that, you're not getting what I'm saying. And what you're doing is you're converting from the absolute domain into the relative domain. Your mind is doing this outside of your awareness. And in so doing, you're never going to be able to access absolute truth if it exists, because you're always converting it into the relative. You see? So you have to be very careful at how you're using your mind here, what kind of questions you're asking, what kind of assumptions you're making. I'm asking you to open your mind to the possibility of an absolute domain. This absolute domain, absolute truth, what it really means. And I want to speak like from direct experience here, because I can actually tune my consciousness right now on absolute truth. Because the absolute truth is right here. See, I'm speaking about absolute truth as though you might, if you're hearing this for the first time, it might almost sound like I'm speaking about some sort of mysterious thing that exists somewhere in the heavens somewhere. No. Absolute truth exists right here. You're immersed in absolute truth. The only question is, are you realizing it or not? And the problem is that you're probably not. So, speaking from direct experience, what absolute truth is it's that which is true under all circumstances and conditions, based on no context. It's independent of context, and it has no other, and it can't be compared to anything else. It's a direct access to what is the case. Truth just means that which is the case. It's a direct access to that which is the case. Directly. That means there's no veil of perception between absolute truth and yourself and your consciousness of it. So that's what I'm really asking you to open your mind to. Are you willing to open your mind to the possibility that there is nothing separating you from absolute truth, and that you can access it directly? In order to open your mind to this, you need to throw away that scientific materialist paradigm idea that you've been taught, that there's a veil of perception between you and truth, that there's some sort of external, maybe absolute truth out there somewhere behind the scenes, but us humans can never know what it is because we're in this bubble of perceptions, and that we can never break through this bubble. Now, open your mind to this possibility. Consider that there never was a veil of perception. Consider that what you have been experiencing your entire life wasn't some sort of foreground behind which there was a actual true background, but that what you were experiencing, the foreground, is the only thing there is, and that is the absolute truth. In other words, what I'm telling you is that open your mind to the possibility that appearance is reality, that appearance is absolutely true. If that is the case, then notice that there is no medium between you and what's true, and you have access to absolute truth at all times. There's nothing stopping you. Perceptions are not in the way. Experience is not in the way. The mind is not in the way. Colors and sensations and feelings are not in the way, because these things are absolutely true. Is your mind open to such a possibility? If it's not, actually open it right now. I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm merely asking you to open your mind. You can either do it or not. And at this point, we have to take this from mere intellectualization to actually doing it. So there is a distinction, there's a difference between merely thinking about these ideas and actually opening your mind to the possibility of direct access to absolute truth. Do that right now. If you need to, pause this recording, sit there, let your mind actually gain traction with the things I've been talking about, and actually consider this alternative way of looking at reality until your mind opens to the possibility of you one day accessing absolute truth, even if it's not going to happen today. Do that. There's a difference between thinking about it and doing it. I'm not asking you to think about it. I'm asking you to do it. Do it until your mind is open. Then something will shift in you. That does not mean that you've all of a sudden discovered absolute truth. It only means you've opened your mind. That's all it means. Do it. Don't think about it, do it. This is where the results come. This is what makes this work different from mental masturbation and from regular old speculative armchair philosophy. You have to actually do it. Then it changes you. If you don't do it, it won't change you. And then you're stuck. So, continuing on about this point, one of the most common objections I get when I talk about absolute truth or share certain aspects or facets of it with people through my videos is this objection. But Leo, how do you know the absolute truth isn't just an experience or a self-deception or a hallucination or just a trip or just some fantasy you made up? How do you know it's not just neurons in the brain generating experiences and stuff and fooling you? A lot of scientifically minded and rationally minded people ask this question. People who ask this question haven't actually opened their mind to the possibility of absolute truth. So again, I'm lingering on this point because it's one thing to just talk about opening your mind. It's another thing to actually open your mind. So again, if you have this objection right now and you're wondering, well, Leo, how could I ever know that what I accessed was absolute truth? How could I ever know that what you're telling me is correct? What if I'm fooling myself? What I mean when I say consider the possibility of absolute truth is I mean it's absolutely true. Because it's singular. There's nothing outside of it. It knows itself simply by being itself. So I want you to consider the possibility that there can exist something in reality that is so true and knows itself to be completely true that it cannot be mistaken, it cannot be deceived, it cannot be hallucinating, it cannot be fantasizing, it cannot be deluded, it cannot be mistaken, it cannot be false. Literally, it is impossible for absolute truth to be false. Is your mind open to such a thing existing? Think carefully about this. Don't just say yes. Get traction with it and actually genuinely ask yourself whether you're open to this. This is a radical idea that I'm suggesting. Your mind may not be open to it, in which case, that's fine. That's where you're at. But at least be honest about it. See, are you open to the idea that you can become conscious of something that is so absolutely true that you can never be wrong about it? A lot of people here would say no. In which case, what I'm telling you is that then you're not open to the existence of absolute truth. That's the problem. The problem is not that I'm deluded or whatever. The problem is that your mind is not open to this possibility. Again, I am not using this to prove to you absolute truth. I'm merely asking is your mind open to that? Because if it's not, that's where this journey ends. You can't go any further. That's where you're stuck, and you'll be stuck there for the rest of your life until you decide to change your mind. And if you have some sort of logic in your mind that says, well, but it's dangerous to open my mind so much to this absolute truth, because Leo, what if I open my mind to this and then I start to believe in something and I think it's the absolute truth, but then it turns out later that it's not, and then I'm mistaken and I'm wrong and it ruins my life. What if that happens? Sure, maybe that could happen, but that is not absolute truth. That is something else. That is beliefs. That's not what I'm talking about when I'm talking about absolute truth. With absolute truth, I'm talking about something that cannot be wrong. It's absolutely true. It cannot be wrong. Again, you may simply not be open to this possibility at all. Many scientists would chime in here and say, Leo, that's not possible. And even if it was possible, how would you know it was possible? Which puts us into a very strange loopy catch-22 epistemological conundrum here, sort of a paradox. Because when you ask the question, how would you know that something is absolutely true? Again, I'm asking you to consider something very radical. If something is absolutely true, it knows itself to be absolutely true. Because it is absolutely true. The tautology here is not a bug, it's a feature. Absolute truth must be absolutely true by definition, by pure tautology. This is not circular logic, this is not begging the question, this is just the possibility of absolute truth. Now, you might say that that's not possible. Then your mind is closed to that possibility. And maybe you're right. Maybe it's not possible. But what if you're wrong? What if it is possible? I want you to notice this. If your mind is closed and you think it's not possible, how can you know it's not possible? Have you explored the entire universe? Have you explored every truth there is to explore in the universe, such that you can now feel confident that absolute truth is impossible and impossible to access? obviously noticed that you haven't. You haven't even explored 1% of the universe. Science hasn't even explored 1% of the universe. And yet you feel so adamant in keeping your mind closed against the possibility of absolute truth. Can you see the problem in that? Can you see that if you're wrong in that, you have fallen into a deep epistemic blunder? If your mind actually carefully contemplates these things that I'm saying, it should open your mind to the possibility of absolute truth. But then again, I can't force you to do it. You'll only do it if you want to do it, if you care about doing it. So, see, the paradox and strangeness of absolute truth is that since it's undivided by anyone's mind, it's one and it's singular. Therefore, you can't even speak about it in terms of validation, because usually the skeptics, what they're looking for is they're looking for some sort of external or other validation of the truth. This is a lot of what the game of science is. It's all about validation. So if, for example, if I discover something as a scientist, I might discover some fact, the speed of light, let's say I discover it's this, it's X. And then as a scientist, I'm trained to doubt that and to say, well, maybe I made some mistakes in my methodology. Maybe my experiment wasn't too good. So I need to get some other scientist who will independently verify, run the experiment himself, and then they will get some result Y. And only if X and Y match can we then agree that this is the true speed of light. And then, the more scientists we bring into this, the more of these independent experiments we do, eventually we can build a consensus of independent sort of cross-referencing experiments and ultimately reach some sort of truth. This is how science protects itself. But remember, this is all operating within the relativistic domain. And then we carry over these expectations. Remember, I warned you about this. We carry these over into the non-dual domain. And now we tend to want to do the same thing with absolute truth. And we tend to want to say, well, if there is this absolute truth, and Leo, you've discovered it or somebody has discovered it. Okay, great. But then let's validate it. And what do I tell you? I tell you it can't be validated. And you say, well, if it can't be validated, it must be false. That's how it works in the relative domain. That's not how it works in the non-dual domain. Because in the non-dual domain, you can't validate the non-dual because validation itself requires two different observers, a division within reality, and two different experiments and two different results, and then combining those together into some sort of synthesis. This all involves duality and relativity. In the non-dual domain, there is no possibility of validation. You can't ask your neighbor to validate non-duality for you. Then, of course, you say, well, but Leo, if it can't be validated in the classical sense, then how can you ever know that it's true? And you think that that's a bug of this system. It's not. This is the core feature of non-duality, is that precisely because there's no other against which to validate it, whatever it is automatically makes it absolutely true. It's absolutely true by virtue of being completely one, singular, and sovereign. It's literally absolutely sovereign. That means it defines what it is. This is very strange, loopy, and foreign to those of us who are operating under the sort of dualistic, relativistic, materialistic way of looking at truth. To really bring this home point to you and to show you how this works, I actually have an episode where I go into this in a lot of detail called How Authority Works. It's one of my underrated episodes. Go watch it. It's actually very profound, and it's very relevant to this issue here. So, see, here's my question to you. How do you know that you exist? Right now, don't just give me a parroted answer. I want you to actually become conscious right now of how it is you know that you exist. You may not know what you are. You may be unsure about that. You may be doubtful. But you certainly, right now, are conscious that you exist. This is true. In fact, it's absolutely true. Your existence is absolute truth right now. Become conscious of your own existence right now. To me, it helps to look at my hand as I do that. So take out your hand and look at your hand and just become conscious that what you're conscious of right here, right now, it absolutely exists. There's no possibility of it not existing when it is existing. You might say, oh, Leo, but what if I'm a computer simulation? No, you don't get it. It doesn't matter if you're a computer simulation. Even if you think all of this is a computer simulation, it exists right here, right now. You're conscious of it. That's absolutely true. Become conscious of this. Don't think about it. Become conscious of it. See, I'm going to tell you something very radical here that you're probably going to doubt, but I'll say it anyways. The only one in the universe who can tell you that you exist is yourself. Think about it. You might initially think no, Leo, that can't be true because I can ask my neighbor, I can call my mom and ask her, Mom, do I exist? And she will say, yes, of course you exist. And in this way, I can validate that I exist and that I'm not crazy. Well, if you think that, you don't understand the depth of this problem of sovereignty and authority. When you call your mother and your mother tells you that you exist, see, the only reason you accept that answer as validation of anything, of your existence, for example, is because you already accept that you exist. If you didn't already accept that you existed and that she existed, then she couldn't use her existence to validate your existence. You see, for her existence to exist, it has to exist within your existence. So when you call her, in a sense, you're begging the question because you're already admitting to yourself that you exist just by calling her and asking her to validate your existence because you're assuming that she exists. You're doing all this implicitly, unconsciously, without being conscious of what you're doing. Therefore, to you, it might seem like this is an actual proof of something. It's not an actual proof of anything. What's really going on in this case is that you exist. That's the bottom line. You exist. And then everything else that you use to validate your existence is already layered upon your existence, is a second order effect of your own existence, right? Because your mother can't exist without you first existing. Your mother, if you think about it, has only ever existed in your existence. Her existence has never been separate from your existence. In fact, the idea of your existence, your mother's existence, this is already one of those divisions that you've made in reality. There really is no such thing as your existence, my mother's existence. There's only existence. In fact, existence is absolute truth. Here it is. Look, existence. Existence absolutely exists. It sort of seems obvious when you put it that way, but what I'm saying is so radically profound. Do not assume that you understand what I'm saying. You don't. You're not conscious of what I'm saying. Even though it might seem like these are just word games, these are not just word games. This is not just word salad. Something very substantial is being said here, but you don't understand what is being said because you're not conscious of it yet. If you did, it would completely blow your mind. So, you see, my point is that you already are relying upon a notion of absolute truth, but you're not honest with yourself about it. And how you're relying upon it is that you believe you exist. And you've believed that your entire existence. And you're not wrong about that. And when I say you, I don't mean the human self. I mean existence itself. I mean consciousness itself. Consciousness itself exists. Consciousness is existence. That's what we're talking about. So see, you take that for granted, and then you use that in order to bootstrap your entire relative framework of relative truths. And then you want to use that framework and reflect it back and try to use it to then apply it to the non-dual absolute truth. And then when that fails to work, you take that as evidence of the fact that there is no absolute truth. And that whole spiel is your self-deception. So the self-deception you have to be worried about here is not that you are hallucinating the absolute truth. It's actually that you are hallucinating its non-existence. That's the self-deception. So we have a self-deception wrapped within a self-deception. So when you think that you are deceiving yourself by believing in absolute truth as a possibility, and you're doubting absolute truth, that doubt of the absolute truth is the self-deception that needs to be cured in order to be able to access absolute truth. In fact, this problem goes so deep that even when people deconstruct much of their mind, like I teach, and then they actually do get a brief glimpse of absolute truth. They get a brief glimpse of it maybe for 5 minutes. Then they fall back down into relativity, into duality, and then they start to second guess themselves and they start to say, oh, well, but what if that was just a hallucination? What if that was just some stuff happening in my brain, in my mind, neurons and things? And what if I was just imagining that and I was constructing something that Leo was talking about? The only reason I experienced this absolute truth was because Leo fed that idea into my mind for years through these videos. What I'm telling you is that when you do that, when you doubt the absolute truth, that is the delusion. And you're not recognizing that. You think by doubting everything, including the absolute truth, that you're actually getting yourself closer to truth. And that turns out to be the ultimate deception. Because doubt itself is something that's part of the relative truth framework. It's not part of non-duality. When you are conscious of absolute truth, what I'm asking you to open your mind to, I'm asking you to open your mind to this following radical thing, is that when you are conscious of the absolute truth, there literally is no more room left for doubt, error, or mistake, or delusion, or the brains and neurons, or a veil of perceptions, or human misunderstanding, or human misperception, or illusion. None of that can exist within absolute truth. Absolute truth means you've pierced through every single veil. So here's what I'm asking you to really open your mind to. Is your mind open to the possibility that you, not anybody else, but you personally, can pierce through absolutely every veil of deception and reach the rock bottom of what reality is? Is that possible? And if your answer is no, then my question to you is, how can you know that? What if you're wrong? Can you see that if you're mistaken on this point and such a thing actually is possible, but you're wrong about it, that you will never be able to validate it for yourself? Because you see, unlike other things which can be validated to you by others, absolute truth is of such a kind that it cannot be validated by any other. Literally. That means when you finally, if you finally reach absolute truth, no human being will be able to validate it for you. Not your mom, not a scientist, not a doctor, not a professor, not your guru, not even Leo. It will only be you. Just like with your own existence. Nobody, and I mean nobody, think about this, this is radical. There is not a single being in the entire universe, no matter how intelligent or advanced technologically, whether they're aliens or angels or whatever, that can validate your own existence to you. No scientist can do it, no professor can do it, no doctor can do it, no theologian, no priest. Your parents can't do it. Nobody can do it but you. That means the only way you can know that you exist is through your own existence. And there is no other way. It's 100% direct. There is no veil. There is no medium. There is no process by which you validate your own existence. Existence exists. It's too direct for there to be a process. Any process you use to validate existence, can you see that that process is already too many steps removed from existence itself? Because every step in the process itself has to exist in order for it to lead to some sort of conclusion. So any proof for existence is absurd and stupid, literally stupid is what it is. Because if you think you can prove existence through some mathematical formula, or through some scientific procedure, or through some kind of experiment, or through calling your mom, or by talking to an alien through some sort of radio communication device, if you think you can prove your own existence that way, you're being so stupid, because that chain itself has to exist for it to prove anything. You see? So literally what I'm saying is that the only way you know you exist is by existing. And while that might seem sort of obvious and sort of a hollow statement, it's actually not. It's a deeply profound statement. What I'm literally telling you is that the only way that reality knows it exists is through its own sovereign self-recognition of its existence. So see, ordinarily we think that, oh, reality just exists. It just exists without us. It just exists somehow, in some way. We don't know how. It just exists. But no, what I'm telling you is that reality only exists if it recognizes its own existence. And if it doesn't, then it can't exist. This makes reality itself absolute truth. Because that's what oneness is. See, oneness, infinity, that which has no ends or bounds, that which has no other to it, cannot have something outside of it which it can reference relativistically to make a proof, to lean upon. It can't be used as a there's no Archimedean point, is what I'm telling you, that you can leverage to actually challenge existence itself, because existence is all that there is. That's the nature of the absolute. There's nothing else you can compare or contrast it with. There's nothing else you can use to define it. The reason you can't put your finger on what existence is because anytime you use your words or your mind to say, oh, existence is X, existence is Y, existence is Z, it has these properties, it has these characteristics. Anytime you're doing that, you're dragging existence from the non-dual domain into the relative domain. And in so doing, you are creating an opposite to existence, which is non-existence, which doesn't actually exist. So when you're doing that, you're not actually conscious of what existence is. When you're fully conscious of what existence is, you actually can't say what it is. It's because it's literally undefinable. You can't define it. Because to define anything, a definition of anything, requires at least two things. The thing you're trying to define and then the thing defining it. But both those things have to exist first. You see, everything boils down to existence. So existence itself is the absolute. And what do I mean by existence? I mean everything. So here we get the ultimate strange loop and paradox, which is that when you actually become conscious of absolute truth, you will realize that there was always only the absolute truth. There never was a relative truth. Because the absolute has no opposite. See, if you're living in a reality where there is absolute truth on the one hand and then there's relative truth on the other hand, that already is part of the relative domain, because it's in the relative domain that you have different kinds of truth. In the absolute domain, there aren't different kinds of truth. There's only absolute truth. So the deep, profound paradox of absolute truth is that while it seems like absolute truth is this airy-fairy notion that exists somewhere in the heavens that can never be accessed, the truth is exactly the opposite, is that the only thing that exists really is absolute truth, because it's absolutely everything, and all the relative stuff that you've been attached to your whole life has just been stories spun by your mind, which of course is a part of the absolute truth, but it's a lack of consciousness of it. It's a misconstrual of it. It's a misinterpretation. Now, of course, some of you who are dense will say, well, Leo, but what if this all sounds good. It sounds like nice philosophy, but what if all of this is just a self-deception? To which I say, what I'm pointing at is something beyond what my words are able to communicate. So when you take the absolute truth and you turn it into stories and words that I'm telling you, and explanations, even explanations like this one, they always become relativistic. All my explanations of absolute truth are all relativistic. They're all finite. So yeah, this here in the relative domain, you can have self-deceptions. But when you are directly conscious of the absolute truth, which you are not right now, then it can't be a self-deception. And then the only question is, are you going to be wise enough to recognize that this is a possibility that you can actualize? And that you haven't actualized it yet, but that you could. Because see, it's hard to actualize something when you don't believe you can even do it, or that it's possible to even do. Now you say, but Leo, but all of that could just be experiences generated by neurons in the brain. No, It can't. If you think that, you're operating in the relative domain. You're not in the absolute. You have to enter the absolute. See, there's no way for you to understand the absolute while sitting in the comfort of the relative domain, because the relative domain is illusion. You have to leave the relative domain and go and inhabit the absolute non-dual domain. You have to do that. And then that is how you validate it. You say, aha, Leo, but you said it couldn't be validated. Well, it can't be validated through anyone but yourself, which is why I talk about direct experience so much. The only way reality can know that it exists is through you. It can't exist in any other way but through you. The mistake that materialists and scientists have made is they've made the mistake of assuming that reality can exist independently of your existence. This is an unscientific, unprovable claim, and it also happens to be false. And you will discover that it's false if you ever enter into the absolute domain and leave behind the relative domain. So you see, the relative domain has extremely powerful hooks and anchors that it has sunk into your mind, deep, deep, deep into your psyche, that is keeping you anchored in the relative domain. And so the struggle here is sort of snipping off all those anchors and hooks that keep you attached. But of course, as you're doing that, you're literally detaching yourself from what you consider reality, because what you consider reality is consensus reality. It's the reality you generated with your fellow human chimps through culture and through even science. Science is part of culture, by the way, and through external validation. See, you are so insecure about taking back your full authority, your absolute sovereignty as the reality that you are, the universe that you are. You're so afraid of taking back your sovereignty, of thinking for yourself, of validating your own truth, that you want somebody else, some other human to validate it for you. You want some guru, you want some professor, you want some scientist, you want somebody with a big name, with lots of charisma, lots of passion. You want someone like me to validate it for you. And in so doing, you will never reach absolute truth and you will forever be deluded. That is the chief delusion. And that is what I explained in my episode called How Authority Works. See, you are unwittingly giving away your authority to imaginary others out there that you created by dividing reality into multiple consciousnesses. And you think that by dividing reality into multiple consciousnesses and giving your authority to those other consciousnesses, whether it's your parents, your government officials, or your TV pundits, or whoever you watch on YouTube, or some guru you like, or whatever priest you listen to, or some textbook you read, or some scientist you enjoy listening to, whoever the authority is, you rely on those people to tell you who you are and that you exist and what's true. Because the truth is that if you didn't rely on any of it, if you cut all those umbilical cords, all that would be left is you and your own mind, which then literally means that whatever your mind imagines becomes the absolute truth. And that is what you're fucking terrified of. Because then you literally have the sovereignty of God. Your imagination becomes absolute. Then when you dream, your dream becomes absolute reality. And by that, I don't mean that you dream of money and then you wake up and there's a bunch of money in your bank account. No. I mean, when you are dreaming about money at night when you're sleeping, that dream is absolutely true as what's happening here right now. That does not mean you're going to get a bunch of money in your bank account. So don't get your hopes up. That's what you're really terrified of. What you're ultimately, your mind is protecting you from realizing this. Why? Because in a sense, this is what you perceive madness to be. What you perceive madness to be is being so lost inside your own mind that you can't tell the difference anymore between what's real and what's unreal. Humans have classified this as insanity or as something that's a problem. And it can be a problem if it's done in a dysfunctional way, but if it's done in a functional way where you're fully conscious of what you're doing and you're not abusing it, then what actually happens is that you discover the ultimate truth. And the ultimate truth is that the entire universe is your imagination at work. And your imagination is completely sovereign. Which is why your reality feels real, no matter how crazy your beliefs and ideas are. Have you ever wondered why, religious fanatics do crazy things? Why people believe crazy things and behave in crazy ways? The MAGA people, the anti-vax people, the pro-vax people, the corporate people, the Muslims, the Jews, the atheists, all these people, they're all fucking crazy. They're all living in their own bubble realities. And they're acting as though their reality is the truth. Why is that? Well, because the ultimate truth is that their imaginations and they're spinning their bubbles, they're spinning their realities. That's God constructing reality. And whatever reality you're dreaming up is the reality you're inhabiting, and that's what feels real to you. And if you're imagining that you can't walk through a wall, that's what your reality becomes. And you're terrified of learning that. Because then you're all alone. See, you can't even ask somebody else to validate this for you. When you realize what I'm telling you, you might think like, oh, I'm gonna email Leo and I'm gonna just double check. Let me double check with Leo if I got this right. Now, if you're emailing Leo to validate this, then you haven't got it. It's completely you. You're completely sovereign. You're completely absolute. But you don't want to accept that because it's too much responsibility to bear. And it leaves you feeling all alone. And then you can't tell what's up, what's down, what's good, what's bad, what's left, what's right, what's true, what's false, what's real, what's unreal, because all those distinctions melt away. And then what you're left with is you're left with absolute consciousness, absolute truth, which is precisely what all this is right now. Right now, you exist as absolute truth. That's all that there is. The problem is that your mind has misconstrued for your entire life what this life, this experience we call life, what it is. It isn't a veil of perception. There aren't atoms behind the scenes. There aren't mathematical calculations happening in the universe behind the scenes. There aren't physical laws behind the scenes somewhere running this show. This is it. Reality is precisely what it appears to be. Consider that radical possibility. Open your mind to the possibility that what is real, what is true, is exactly what is before you right now. Stop imagining any more layers to reality than what you see. Consider for a moment this radical possibility that this is it. Absolute truth does not look like numbers or computer simulations or angels or bearded men in the clouds or atoms or quarks or strings or multiverses or universes. It doesn't look like any of that. It looks exactly like this right now. This is it. This. You. This is absolute truth. And everything else is shit you're imagining, which is still part of the absolute truth, but it is imaginary. When you think of quarks and brains and neurons and experiences and veils of perception and different spectra of electromagnetic radiation to which you're not privy to, when you think about different conscious entities, when you think about rattlesnakes and bats and dolphins and whales and all their ways of perceiving the world, when you think about angels and devils and you think about aliens perceiving the world in different ways, all of that is this right now. You're fucking imagining it right now. Isn't that true? Don't believe me? Take a look. Take a look. Anything I'm saying that's true is only true because it's present for you right now. If it's not present for you, it's not true. Something else is true for you because you're imagining that's something else, whatever that is. See, like if you imagine, like some New Age people do, some New Age people imagine that they're aliens from other planets, starseeds and Arcturians and whatever else. See, if you imagine deeply enough that you're an alien from another planet, that becomes your reality. And nobody, and I mean nobody, can change that. If you want to believe you're an alien and you really want to go with it all the way, you can believe it, and no matter what anybody tells you, you'll keep believing it and believing it and believing it, and it'll just become your reality. After all, that's exactly what you did to become human. See, the only difference is that it was a little bit easier for you to become a human because when you started to believe that you're a human, people weren't naysaying you and saying, oh, you're bad for believing you're human. How dare you? You're insane, which they would do if you tell them that you're an alien. But see, when you became a human, the way you did it is you just started to believe you're a human and you started imagining more and more that you're human, you're human, you're human. And then others around you, because they were doing the same thing, because you're playing the same game, they kept reinforcing in you, yeah, you're a human, you're a good human, you're a good human, bad human, bad human, bad human, don't do that, don't believe this, that's bad, this is good, believe this. Don't believe you're an alien, that's bad, believe you're a human, that's good. Don't believe you're a cat or a dog, that's bad, believe you're a human, that's good. Right? And they kept reinforcing that in you more and more and more, and then you grew up that way, and then now you think you're a human, and you think you're actually a human, and you think you were born a human, and you think that there's no other way you could be. And you think that this is a scientific truth. But you see, if we took a human and we just did that and we just replaced human with alien, we could raise a human that believed he's an alien. Just using the exact same process. Just through social pressure and reinforcement. And that person would legit believe that he's an alien. Yeah, it's twisted. It's heavy stuff. Heavy stuff. Not very easy to swallow all this. So see, what's really crucial, the whole point of all this is that I want to preempt a trap for you. The trap I want to preempt is this: is that some of you doing this work will actually, maybe within a year or two, stumble upon absolute truth. You'll get a glimpse of it. You'll get a 5, 10, 20-minute glimpse, maybe a 60-minute glimpse of it. Maybe during a psychedelic experience, maybe through some meditation, through some yoga, through some shamanic breathing, maybe through a solo retreat. You'll get a glimpse of it. But then what'll happen is that you'll come crashing back down, and then your mind will try to protect you from that by telling you, oh, well, that was just a trip. Oh, well, that's just hallucination. Oh, it's just neurons in the brain. Oh, it's just an experience. It was just a mystical experience. and there's no way to validate it. And then you'll forget about it and drop back down into your human life. And in this way, you will never fully actualize absolute truth, and you'll never fully get a real deep experience of it, because a little glimpse of it is not the same as a deep experience of it. To get the deep experience of it, you have to really embrace the oneness, the sovereignty, take full responsibility, take back all of your authority, really understand that nobody will validate it for you, and that is not a bug, that's a feature, and this is actually what you want. You want to become absolute. What does it mean to be absolute? You can't be absolute unless you're sovereign about the construction of your reality. To be absolute means that you recognize that this reality is your responsibility and no one else's. Nobody else is doing it. You are doing it. Nobody else is to blame. Nobody else can validate your existence. Nobody else can tell you whether you're sane or insane. Nobody can tell you whether you're being a good person or a bad person, a moral person or not a moral person, a spiritual person or not a spiritual person. Nobody can tell you whether you're doing your spirituality right or wrong. Only you can figure that out and know that. And it's from that comes the ultimate confidence, the ultimate strength, an unshakable, unwavering imperturbability, a groundedness. You're grounded in the absolute at that point. Now, some people here will object and they'll say, but Leo, what if somebody follows this advice, they do that, and then they delude themselves because they do it in the wrong way, and then they start to believe that they're an alien or something. And then they're 100% confident about it, that they're this alien, or that they're 100% confident that the world is coming to an end, so they have to go out there and murder people. Or they're 100% confident that because everything is love, that they're allowed to go around raping people. To which my answer is, yes, that is certainly possible. There are a million ways to fuck this up. And for every one person that succeeds in actualizing what I'm talking about, there will be 1,000 who become murderers and rapists and cult leaders and exploiters and manipulators and criminals and wind up in insane asylums. But you know what? That's already the case. That's already the case. In the relative paradigm in which we're living, the materialist paradigm in which we're living, we already got plenty of terrorists and murderers and rapists and thieves and criminals and corporate raiders and white-collar criminals and swindlers and grifters and corrupt politicians and dictators and child abusers and animal abusers. We already got millions of those people. We got millions of mentally ill people. We got millions of depressed people. We've got millions of bipolar people. We've got millions of just fucking psychotic people. So that why don't you count those against the materialist paradigm, against the relative dualist paradigm? So you seem to take every little hiccup that happens along the non-dual path, you take it as against the non-dual path, but then all the shit, the war, the slavery, the genocide, the corporate exploitation, the wage slavery, the actual slavery, the religious indoctrination, the scientific blunders and disasters and wars and technological death that is caused by pharmaceuticals and by nuclear weapons and by radiation, by heavy metals. You take all that and you completely ignore all that. And then as soon as there's a little hiccup on the non-dual path, you say, oh, that means the non-dual path is so dangerous. Well, how much more dangerous is it than what you're doing already? What you've been doing your whole life? what you've been seeing on the news. That's the dual path, what you've been seeing on the news. The nature of the absolute is that anything you think or imagine about the absolute is not the absolute. That's the paradox. But there's a further paradox which makes it even more of a mindfuck, which is this, is that at the same time, everything that you think and imagine about the absolute is the absolute, but not at the level at which you think it is. Try interpreting that correctly. If this sounds like word salad, if it sounds like Zen, it's because there's a reason why Zen sounds like Zen, because you can't bring the absolute into the relative. And speech is the relative. Language is relative. Logic is relative. You cannot do logic on the absolute, at least not the kind of logic you're used to. There's a sort of different kind of higher order, we might call it sort of an infinite logic, a non-dual logic, but it's a very paradoxical logic. The absolute cannot ever be spoken or thought of without paradox or contradiction. This is not a bug, this is a feature, because the absolute is total, it's all-encompassing, and it's one. So make a distinction, please, between two types of absolute to make this more confusing. There's absolute with a lowercase a and absolute with an uppercase a. Absolute with an uppercase a is what I'm pointing at when I'm talking about the absolute. So anytime I say the word absolute, I'm actually just using a word, a relative word. Absolute as separate from relative. These are two words, concepts, thoughts. When I say the word absolute, that is not the actual thing. The actual thing is what the word is pointing at, but can never be spoken. That's the uppercase A absolute. So the lowercase a absolute is just a concept. It's an idea. You have an idea of absolute. You have an idea of God. You have an idea of infinity. You have an idea of love. You have an idea of everythingness. You have an idea of nothingness. These are all ideas. These are not the same thing as the actual things those words point at. But also, they are. Because language and words are part of the absolute. But they're not the entirety of it. And it's not what we're concerned with in this conversation. Then I want you to make a further distinction. I want you to make a distinction between absolute truth as the actual thing being pointed at versus as dogma and as ideology. See, so there's a pre-trans fallacy that happens here. See, one of the problems with teaching about the absolute from a higher level perspective, from a sort of spiral dynamics tier 2 perspective, is that those at tier 1, when they hear about absolute truth, they will misconstrue it as pre-rational, falling into the pre-trans fallacy, and they will construe it as like, oh, well, Leo is talking about the absolute truth. That means he must be some sort of crackpot, religious fanatic cult leader, because he actually believes that his beliefs are true, absolutely true. But that is not what Leo is saying. Leo is saying something much, much, much more nuanced and more radical and complex than this. I'm saying something trans, not pre. By trans, what I mean is that, so see, there's sort of 3 levels that humans go through. The first level is that humans get mired in absolute truth as ideology and dogma. This is what you see in the Middle East a lot. This is what you see in evangelical Christian circles. Orthodox religious traditions fall into the sort of spiral dynamic stage, red and blue, absolute truth. They actually believe that Jesus was the Son of God, this sort of stuff. Like, they take the Bible literally as absolute truth. This is a very low level of cognitive development. This is the pre-stage. Then you grow out of that and you reach the stages orange and green, where now you realize that that stuff wasn't literally true. The stories in the Bible aren't literally true. They're mostly just myths and exaggerations and so forth. you realize that it's stage orange and green. And then to you, people who claim absolute truth, those seem like lunatics. You want nothing to do with those people. They seem unscientific. They seem religious. They seem small-minded. They seem myopic. They seem bigoted. Because usually people who latch onto absolute truth, they are bigoted. Literally, they're bigoted. Because their mind is so closed off to that little perspective. But you have to understand that that is not really absolute truth. That is just beliefs and dogma. And then so people who are at stage orange and green, this is perhaps one of the most dangerous stages, because here you actually are going to university, you're reading books, you're studying science, mathematics, logic, and all this, postmodernism, maybe even a little bit. You're studying this stuff, you're understanding this stuff. And now it seems to you that you have this scientific worldview that now you understand that relative truth, that absolute truth is just all, human constructions and such, and dogmas. And now finally you're free of such a silly notion. And you think you've made it. Well, you haven't made it. You're stuck in the middle. Now there's the trans level, the really complex advanced stuff, which is what I'm talking about. The position I'm talking about is the place that, okay, so you've discovered that those are all myths and stuff in the Bible and so forth. But then what about the actual shit that the Bible was pointing to? You say, well, that stuff, it didn't exist. The Bible was pointing to nothing. And that's where you're wrong. The Bible was pointing to something. It was horribly corrupted and misconstrued, but the Bible was pointing to something. What was the Bible pointing to? What was Jesus pointing to? What was the Buddha pointing to? What was Moses pointing to? What was Muhammad pointing to? They were pointing to absolute truth with a capital A, but you can't speak it. You can't logic it. You can't science it. You can't run an experiment on it. You can't validate it. And so the problem is that whenever I speak from that level, people assume that I'm speaking from just a religious dogmatic level. And that's really a shame. That's the pre-trans fallacy, so watch out for that. And it'll happen to you too. If you're going to be teaching others about this stuff, it'll happen to you. People will, even just using the word God. See, sometimes I hesitate to use the word God because I know that in any episode where I use the word God, immediately half the audience will think that I'm a stage blue religious fanatic or a Christian or an evangelical or something just for saying the word God. That just for saying that word. And then sometimes people say, well, Leo, why use that word? That's such a religiously loaded word. It's not a good word. Use a word like nothingness or something and it's better. Use a word like the universe. It's better. But actually, when you realize that you're God, you'll understand why that word is used. It's the perfect word. The problem is just it's corrupted. But it's always going to be corrupted. Any word you use for God will end up corrupted, so you can't avoid that problem. It's just nature of the beast. Because you can't translate the absolute into any words. Notice, you might wonder, Leo, how do I know if a truth is conceptual, if a truth is relative, or if a truth is absolute? Well, an easy way to know if a truth is relative is that notice that all relative truths are conceptual. That means, is your truth at the level of language, or logic, or thought, or mind, or concepts? Then it's a relative truth. Absolute truth is at the level of being. So a great analogy that I like to use here is the Lego analogy. The Lego analogy is, look, we have Lego blocks. We can build any shape we want with them. We can build a pirate ship. We can build a castle, whatever. Let's assume we're going to build one of those medieval castles. So in this analogy, the Lego blocks themselves are the absolute truth, and the shape that the blocks create, that's the relative truth. So the castle is relative, the Legos themselves are not, they're absolute. Do you see the difference? Can you see that the shape of the Lego castle is a second order effect of the blocks? there's a hierarchical dependency in that the Legos can exist without the castle, but the castle can't exist without the Legos. Likewise, for example, you can have existence with no proof, but you can't have proof without existence. See? Because truth is prior to proof. Likewise, you can exist without other people, but other people can't exist without you, because all other people exist within you. So you are the Lego block, and the other people in your life are the castle that is built with those blocks. This is why you can't use them to validate truth for you, because you are prior to other people. You exist prior to all humans, including your own human self. Therefore, you cannot use a human to validate that which is prior to humans. I mean, this is very basic, common sense stuff. It's just that people don't like to think about it very much. So the absolute, just to be clear, the absolute is the actual building blocks of which everything is composed. In other words, if we want to use a term from philosophy of science, the absolute is qualia. Colors, sounds, feelings, emotions, tastes, smells, thoughts. These sort of sense perceptions, we might say, this is the substratum of which reality is composed. And everything else is secondary. Reality is not composed of atoms. Atoms are composed of colors and thoughts and feelings and sensations. Science has that relationship inside out, and that's why it's so confused. And that's why it's stuck with the hard problem of consciousness. Here's another helpful analogy to distinguish between relative and absolute truth. If you think of the Sherlock Holmesian universe, the fictional universe of Sherlock Holmes in, Victorian England or wherever and whenever, his universe takes place, there are truths within the fictional universe of Sherlock Holmes, facts that we could cite. I haven't actually read the Sherlock Holmes books, but if you read the books, you can make factual claims. Like, for example, Sherlock Holmes lives in a house on such and such a street with such and such a house number. Is that true or is that false? It's one or the other. Or you could say Sherlock Holmes is either married or unmarried. One of them is true, one of them is false. He has children or he doesn't. True or false? His parents are still alive or they're dead. True or false? He has a detective partner named Watson. True or false? And so on. We can generate a list of factual statements about the Sherlock Holmes's, fictional universe. Do the cars drive on the right or on the left in the Sherlock Holmesian universe? Supposedly that's like a fact. I don't know. It depends on how the author set that up. Those would all be relative truths. What are they relative to? They're relative to how the author chose to write the story. See, the author could have written the story otherwise. Author could have given Sherlock Holmes a different street address, different house number, a wife or children, or his parents could have died, or they could still be alive, or any number of things. Cars can drive on whatever side of the road of the city that the author wants, because it's a fictional universe. It's a dream. It's imaginary. But we can still make factual statements about how the author chose to write that particular story. And that is what science is doing in our dream world here that we call life. So when science is making its objective, factual statements, it's doing exactly the same thing as we would do with the fictional universe of Sherlock Holmes. So there's no surprise that it works. Yes, it works in a relative sense. It's true in a relative sense. It's true that Sherlock Holmes has a partner named Watson. Does that make Watson real? Does that make Sherlock Holmes any more real? No, they're still fictional characters. The relative truth doesn't care about the actual reality of what it's talking about because all it is just a comparison. Likewise with what science is doing here. Like, does science ask the question whether atoms are real or not? No, science doesn't care whether atoms are real or not. All it cares about is just measuring what's there and manipulating it. Does science care if the moon is real or not? No. Landing a man on the moon has nothing to do with the reality of the moon. You can land a man on an imaginary moon as long as the man is imaginary too. That's the mindfuck of all this. So even though that whole Sherlock Holmesian universe is a fiction, it is imaginary, it is a dream, and it is all relative, and it could have been imagined otherwise, the way it's being imagined itself is absolutely true. Do you get that? The substance, we might say the actual physical book on which the Sherlock Holmesian story is written, that would be analogous to absolute truth in this metaphor. See? The actual substrate of the book is existence. The book exists. It's consciousness. It exists in your consciousness. And that is absolutely true. So you see, contrary to what many people think about the absolute and the relative, people fall into one side or the other, is that we have people who become dogmatic absolutists, like religious fanatics. That becomes a huge toxic problem. They give absolutism a bad name. And then we have people who become the opposite of that. The polar opposite is like total relativists, and they believe everything is just open to interpretation. Everything is just purely subjective. There is no absolute truth. The truth is just whatever we want it to be. And then they create all sorts of disasters as well. This becomes a problematic worldview as well. The truth is somewhere actually in between. It's kind of intertwined. It's that the absolute and the relative, these are not polar opposites, but rather these are deeply intertwined, like a double-stranded DNA helix, aspects of one unified whole reality. Relativity is not a contradiction of the absolute, and the absolute truth's existence is not a contradiction of relativity. It's actually the two perfectly, seamlessly, cohesively add up together like the yin-yang symbol. So technically, absolute truth cannot be spoken, but it can be spoken about, which is what all spiritual teachings are, whether it's the Bible or Buddhism or what I teach. It's speech about the absolute. And this speech, you have to be very careful because it comes with inherent limitations. All speech has these inherent limitations. Spiritual speech is not immune to these limitations, and they must always be kept in mind. So, spiritual speech is not the absolute itself, but it can point to the absolute, as hopefully this speech is doing. But also at the same time, of course, speech itself is not separate from the absolute. And the absolute is not separate from the relative. If you think the relative is here and the absolute is somewhere out there, you got it wrong. The relative and the absolute are exactly standing in the same place, overlapping each other, which is why they're so difficult to distinguish and to see one or the other, because usually you're only seeing one or the other, but not both at the same time, because they're so overlapping. They're so close to each other. There's no distance between them. You have to be very clear about which you're speaking about, the absolute or the relative. This leads to a set of traps, which I call conflating of the relative and the absolute and vice versa. And this is common. You see this made a lot of times by newbies who get into this work, and even by advanced teachers who have already reached the absolute. Then they make a conflation in the opposite direction. So I want to give you some examples of this conflation because I see it happening all the time on my forum, in the comment sections, and hey, I'm guilty of committing it myself. I'll give you some examples of that too. So what happens with this conflation is that you become conscious either of the relativity of nature or the absoluteness of nature, and then you get stuck on that one way of looking at the world or at nature, and then you try to carry over the lessons from the absolute into the relative and from the relative into the absolute, and it becomes a mess because you're not carefully distinguishing the two. So here are some examples of relative speech about the absolute. That easily gets misunderstood and taken as the absolute. So for example, we are all one. Is that true? Yeah. Is that absolute truth? Actually, no, it's a relative truth. Because all speech is relative truth. It's a relative truth about the absolute. It's pointing to something. How about the statement, the brain does not exist? Is that true? Yes, relatively true. Is it absolutely true? It's pointing to some absolute truth that you could access. And the sentence itself, when it's uttered, is absolute truth. But at a sort of first order level, not a second order level that you usually think of it as. Reality is a hallucination. Is that true? It's relatively true. It's relative speech about the absolute. Everything is consciousness. Again, that's a relative speech about the absolute. You are God. That's also relative speech about the absolute. The purpose of life is waking up. That's also relative speech about the absolute. Nothing is good or bad. That's also relative speech about the absolute. Life is meaningless. That's relatively true. Science is a human invention and science is relative. That's relatively true. Other people do not exist. That's relatively true. There is no one to become enlightened. That's relatively true. You have no control over reality. That's relatively true. Enlightenment happens by itself. That's relatively true. You are immortal. That's relatively true. Death is impossible. That's relatively true. But none of those statements themselves are what they are pointing to. Here are some examples of conflations that happen. For example, nothing is good or bad, so it's okay if I steal. See, nothing is good or bad. That's sort of that's a relative statement that you get from accessing the absolute. When you access the absolute, you'll realize nothing is good or bad. Okay, but then you can bring that back into the relative domain and say, well, if nothing is good or bad, that means I guess I can steal. That's a mistake. Now, of course, don't get me wrong, you can steal, and stealing is not wrong per se in the absolute sense, but in the relative sense, stealing is a problem. And that's where stealing occurs. Stealing doesn't occur in the absolute sense. Stealing occurs in the relative domain. And when you get punished for stealing, and when people criticize you and judge you for stealing, they're going to be doing that from the relative domain of survival. And the reason you're probably stealing is also from relative reasons, like you want food, or you want luxury, or you want money, or you want freedom, whatever. That's why you steal. So you have to be very careful about how you bring back and distort lessons from the absolute into the relative domain, because the ego loves to do that. Oh, yes, it does. Because see, you get a glimpse of the absolute, but the ego is still not fully dead. And the ego will come back and it'll co-opt that truth and use it for its own egoic purposes, for survival, to enhance its survival. How about a statement like, life is meaningless? That is a truth you will realize if you access the absolute. But then you can bring it back down to the relative and you can say, well, if life is meaningless, then I'm going to sit on my couch and watch television. That's what I should do, because life is meaningless. But no, that's not what life is meaningless actually means. That's a distortion. That's a conflation. How about the statement, reality is a hallucination? That's something you'll realize if you access the absolute. But then you try to bring it back down into the relative and say, well, if reality is a hallucination, that means I can walk through walls, right? No, wrong. Because the walls of your house being unwalk-throughable is your hallucination. Therefore, of course, you can't walk through them because you're hallucinating that you can't. Just like in a dream. You see, like in your dreams at night when you sleep, what keeps you from falling through the floor of your house? Because after all, the floor of your house in your dream isn't made out of anything solid. It's not made out of atoms. So the question is, why don't you fall through the floor? So the answer is exactly the same reason as why you don't fall through the floor wherever you're standing or sitting right now. There's no difference because you're hallucinating the floor in both cases. Another absolute sort of truth is that there is no one to become enlightened. That's true in a sense. But then you can sort of misconstrue that in the relative domain. Like a newbie might hear that and might say, oh, well, if there's no one to become enlightened, that means it's impossible to become enlightened. And that would be false. It is possible. Another example like this is enlightenment happens all by itself. It's a spontaneous occurrence, an act of grace. You've heard certain spiritual teachers preach this. Some newbie who is stuck in the relative domain might hear that and misconstrue that and then conflate it and say, oh, well, that means I should stop meditating. If enlightenment happens by itself, then why meditate? Of course, that's a gross misconstrual of that teaching. How about the teaching that the ego has no control over your life? That's something you'll realize when you awaken to the absolute. But then you can misconstrue that, and then someone who, let's say, is struggling to lose weight in the relative domain, they might say, oh, well, I can't lose weight because the ego has no control. So I just can't control myself. I just eat everything. Oh, yeah? Well, then how come I can lose weight? I also don't have an ego, just like you. But for some reason, I'm able to lose weight, but you're not. Maybe that's just an egoic excuse. Maybe you actually do have that ego, and it's sneaking in with all these excuses about why you can't lose weight. See, whether you have an ego or you don't, you can lose weight, you can gain weight. The ego has really no say on whether you're going to gain or lose weight. Here's another common, funny one that I get sometimes. Sometimes we say, we are all one, right? You say that as a spiritual teacher. And then some snarky, troll in the comments section says something like, oh, well, Leo, if we're all one, why don't you send me all your money? Again, a conflation of the absolute and the relative. See, if we're all one, why would I need to send you all my money? If we're all equally one, why don't you send me your money? That's equally plausible. Why do you have this bias of me sending you money? As soon as you send me some money, maybe I'll send you some money. See, what goes around comes around. Here's another one. Leo, you say that you're immortal. Okay, yeah, from the absolute perspective, you are immortal. But then someone might say, oh, Leo, so then you don't mind if I shoot you? No, actually, I do mind if you shoot me because I still also live in the relative domain of survival, and shooting me is about survival, and I do care about my survival. And you might say, well, Leo, you're a hypocrite because you're not supposed to care about your survival. But nothing about being immortal says I'm not supposed to care about my survival as a human, because the human self is relative and it's mortal and it's finite. And if you have certain relative objectives, like if you want to teach people, then you got to maintain your body. You got to eat well. You got to, shower. You got to go to the bathroom. You got to take care of your sexual needs in a healthy way. You got to earn money and so forth. So there's no contradiction between these things. Sometimes people say, oh, well, if you're enlightened, why do you charge money for teachings? Well, I would happily not charge any money for teachings if the world didn't expect money from me for survival. See, I charge money for teachings because I got to eat. And I can't go to the grocery store and pay them with enlightenment. I got to pay them with cold hard cash. That's what people want. And, if I want a house to live in, I can't just go to the real estate agent and look at them with a sort of a Eckhart Tolle eyes and get a free house. They're going to want a hard, cold check, which requires money. And I can't teach unless I live in a house and I eat food, because that's what survival entails. And if you can't understand that, then you got more study to do, more contemplating to do. Here's another conflation that might happen, is that someone hears me talking about the absolute or about God, like a Christian hears me say that, or a Muslim hears me talk about Allah or something, and then they say, oh, well, that means that my religion is true. No, it doesn't mean that. There's actually a lot of bullshit within your religion, and the way you're misinterpreting your religion is deeply false. And the God and the absolute that I'm talking about is further away from your religion than probably atheism is. But, you just hear the word absolute, you hear the word God, and then in your mind, to your ego, it sounds good to validate whatever your existing beliefs are. How about this one? Maybe your girlfriend asks you, did you cheat on me? And you, because you're this absolutely awakened, non-dual master, you say, well, cheating is just a social construct, baby. Get over it. See, when you do that, you're conflating the absolute with the relative. And see, the ego is extremely crafty, and it will do this. When you do reach high levels of awakening, if you ever do, watch out, because your mind is still going to be sneaky. It's still going to be around, and it's going to be using the absolute in all sorts of ways like this. You might actually go cheat on somebody and then justify it to yourself as like, well, I have too much love in my heart to just commit myself to one person, so I'm going to sleep around with everybody, and it's okay because I'm just so loving. You might do that easily, even if you're enlightened. How about another one? I say that the brain is imaginary. From the absolute perspective, that's correct. There's no brain, you're imagining it, but see, in the relative domain of survival, and that's where the word brain really comes from. Brain is a relative word. In that domain, for example, if you drink dirty, heavy metal polluted water, like your tap water filled with mercury and lead and stuff, if you drink that tap water every day for years, that might destroy your brain's health. You might become depressed, you might even become suicidal and psychotic after enough of that poisonous water. And then you might say, oh, Leo, but you said there's no brain. So supposedly I should be able to drink a glass of mercury with no problem. No, that's not what it means to say there's no brain. Brain is a relative notion, and drinking a glass of mercury is also a relative notion, and if you do, you're going to encounter another relative notion called heavy metal toxicity. That's also a relative notion. And then you might discover another relative notion, which is called illness and suffering. And then you might discover the ultimate relative notion, which is called death. And then, if you're okay with that, then you'll die. But if you're not, which you probably aren't, then it's probably not a good idea to drink a glass of mercury. How about this? Everything is love. And since everything is love, that means junk food is love. Leo, why demonize junk food? Junk food is good because everything is good. God created everything, including junk food, so that means I can eat all the junk food in the world, right? Well, you see the problem there. Pretty obvious. Sometimes it's said that there is no path to awakening. And then some newbie will hear that and interpret it as, well, if there's no path, that means I can awaken just by continuing my ordinary life. I don't need to meditate. I don't need to study. I don't need to practice. I don't need to self-inquire. And then, of course, he'll never awaken. How about this? In the absolute sense, you might discover one day that everything is perfect and good. And then you might take that and then you might misconstrue it in the relative domain like this, where you might say, well, if everything is perfect and good, then what's the problem with suffering? Why should we care about reducing people's suffering in the world? Well, of course, suffering is a relative problem. And reducing people's suffering is a relative concern. At the absolute level, it doesn't matter whether people suffer or not. But at the relative level, it does matter. Mostly because the suffering comes back around to you. See, you might not care about the suffering of your neighbors, but then if your neighbors suffer enough, they'll come and inflict some suffering on you and on your children, on your family, and then you'll probably care, even if you are awakened. You'll probably still care. It's not hard to make you care about the relative. Pretty easy. All we have to do is stick your nuts in a vice or stick a needle in your eye, and you'll very quickly start to care about the relative. Neo-Advaitins love to say that you're already awake and that there's no need for enlightenment because you're already enlightened. Everyone's already enlightened. Yeah, that's sort of true from the absolute perspective. But see, they commit the sort of opposite mistake, is that they go so deep into the absolute that they then can't teach properly, meeting students where they're at. See, the student coming to a Neo-Advaitin for awakening advice is not coming from the absolute perspective, they're coming from the relative perspective. So the student needs relativistic teachings. The proper relativistic teaching to a student is enlightenment is very difficult to do. It takes years of work, sometimes decades of work. You got to meditate your ass off. You got to read books. You got to study. You got to do self-inquiry. You got to practice yoga, take psychedelics, do all this shit, and maybe you'll have a chance in hell of becoming enlightened. That's really the practical advice at the relative level. At the absolute level, you're already enlightened. But that doesn't help a newbie. How about this? Sometimes I say death is imaginary. At the absolute level, yes, it is. And then some newbie hears that and says, well, Leo, then why don't you just kill yourself? But what's the connection? If death is imaginary, why would I want to kill myself? How about this? You are God. You've heard me say that before. And then I might say, I have an illness or I'm sick. And then you might wonder, a newbie at the relative stage might wonder, well, how is it possible that God could be sick or could have an illness? Why don't you just magically wave a magic God wand and fix yourself, heal yourself magically, since you're God? But that's not how God works. God includes sickness. God includes cancer. God includes genetic disorders. God includes toxicity. God includes losing your hand in a wood chipper. God is all those things. So it's very, very possible for you to be enlightened and deeply awakened and still have some sort of illness from genetics or from toxicity from your environment or from improper diet or from the past, the way you used your body in the past or abused it in the past through physical injury, the way you exercise or lack thereof. There's or just old age. I mean, everybody ages differently. When you realize you're God, it's not that now you get to control and manipulate everything the way you want. It's actually the opposite of that. You surrender to the way everything is. So when you realize you're God, it's not that you cure your cancer. Actually, it's that you accept your cancer and you let it kill you if it will. If there's no other solution, then you let the cancer kill you. But if there is a solution, you can work to try to fix it, get chemo or something. You see, people assume that the way that God heals cancer is by waving a magic wand. No, I mean, it could be that, but it also could be God heals cancer by going to a doctor and getting it surgically removed or getting some chemo. That's also a legitimate way to heal cancer. And then sometimes God can't heal cancer And God dies from cancer. Ramana Maharshi died from cancer. He is considered to be one of the most enlightened people in the last century. How about this? Like, Leo, you talk about birth being imaginary. Yes, it is from the absolute perspective. And then you might wonder, well, Leo, but you also talk about your past. You talk about being a child. You talk about your past experiences that you've had. How can you reconcile those two things? You talk about your parents. I thought your parents were imaginary. Yes, when I'm talking about my past or my parents, I'm speaking relativistically. I'm sort of speaking towards the consensus reality that us humans have co-imagined together. Us humans, culturally, we have a notion that we all have parents and we have a past and so forth, and we speak in this way, and it's a convenient, practical way to speak. That's why we created it, because it's practical. If I had to explain to everybody that I'm talking to about how birth is imaginary, I couldn't have a conversation with people. So I just ignore that part. Usually, if I'm speaking to my accountant about, I ask the accountant, how are your kids? And he asks me like, what were you up to last weekend? And what am I going to tell him? I'm going to say, well, last weekend didn't really happen because I'm God. I'm just imagining it. It's all just a hallucination. Am I going to tell him that? Or am I just going to say, oh yeah, last weekend, I went to a barbecue. I'll just tell him that because I'm speaking relativistically. And if someone asks me like, Leo, what were you like as a child? I can still answer that. It's going to be relative to how I imagine myself I was as a child. I'm imagining myself as a child. And then I'm reporting it to you. And that's what my childhood is. That's what yours is too. But I mean, you can be conscious of it or not, up to you. So you see, there's all sorts of these kinds of conflations that can happen. These conflations can happen in both directions. Most of these conflations, I would say, would actually happen when a newbie at the relativistic stage first starts to learn about the absolute, but hasn't accessed it himself yet. A lot of conflation happens, a lot of gross distortions and ignorance. But it can also happen the other way, where a teacher becomes so awake, so enlightened, that then they too easily dismiss the relativistic perspective, the survival perspective, or they sort of talk down and don't meet the student where he's at. For example, I caught myself doing this recently with a model. Like somebody on the forum shared Ken Wilber's 4 quadrants model, and my initial gut reaction reply to it was something like, oh, it's just a dualistic model, sort of actually a quadratic. Not dualistic, but more of a quadratic model. I sort of poked fun at it. But then I realized to myself, I'm being too flippant and too conflating from the top sort of down, because what I notice is that, I still use models. I talk about spiral dynamics. I talk about the Susan Kagruiter model. There's lots of models I talk about. So it's not per se that all models are evil or bad. It's just that like you have to be fair. If you're going to criticize a model for being a model, then you got to criticize all your own models too. So it's not fair for me to criticize Ken Wilber's model, 4-quadrant model, for being a model when I'm also using models. So you have to be very kind of even-handed in how you do criticisms and dismissals of stuff, because you can very easily dismiss a lot of stuff from the absolute perspective. And I think that's sort of one of the phases you'll go through is as you reach the absolute, and then you're communicating with sort of normies. The normies might say something like, oh, yesterday my girlfriend broke up with me and now I'm suffering. And you'll just sort of brush it off and say, oh, that suffering is just a dream. Or, your friend loses a bunch of money and you say, oh, money's just imaginary. Just like, who cares? And then, and then something happens in the political system and you say, oh, well, politics is all just bullshit and imagination. And it's all just devilry, and it's not true. It's all relative. But you see, very quickly you'll realize that this sort of cavalier attitude isn't very healthy, and it's not the most mature form of realization. Because the reality is that the relative domain is pretty damn important for most people, because most people are never going to reach your level of consciousness. And even you yourself might struggle to reach your own highest peaks of consciousness, which you're sort of taking your highest lessons from. So what you have to be very careful with here is be careful using absolute truth to justify any kind of survival activities or desires or needs of your own, because the ego will want to do that. The ego will want to apply absolute truth selectively for its own purposes. Ego loves to play loose with the truth. Ego will weaponize both relativity and the absolute in order to fulfill its agenda and manipulate reality in whatever way it can. This is what lawyers do. This is what criminals love to do. They're experts at doing this. Religious people do this. Political commentators do this. It's a very, very sticky trap. And that's what's key to understand, is that the ego can exploit both absolutism and relativism towards its own devilish purposes. It's also important to understand that relative truth, even though it's not absolutely true by definition, it's still crucial to survival, because all of survival happens in the relative domain, pretty much. And survival is pretty much what 99% of your life is preoccupied with, and pretty much all that you care about. In a sense, to most ordinary people, relative truth may as well be absolute truth from their point of view, because they know nothing else. That's the tragedy of their predicament, is that relative truth is completely untrue, but they treat it as though it's the only thing there is, and therefore it does, in a sort of sense, become a sort of pseudo-absolute from their point of view again. Which is why it's so powerful to then break free, because when you break free, it is like flipping your entire reality upside down, and it creates a lot of new possibilities in your life. See, murder, for example, is a relative problem, but it would be a big problem for you if you got murdered, because all you basically know and care about is the relative domain. So even though murder is not a problem in the absolute sense, in a relative sense, it's a very big problem. It's the biggest problem you can have in the relative domain, pretty much. So be careful dismissing the relative too quickly. As long as you want to stay alive for longer than a day, you have to be concerned about the relative domain, no matter how enlightened you are, how awake you are, how God-realized you are. If you want to stay in the human form, that's a relative form. It's finite, and it requires certain survival activities of you. You got to feed the body, water the body, clean the body, take care of the body, and so on, to make sure it continues to function. The ultimate problem with absolute truth is that it's simply too big for it to be useful. Precisely because it's everything, is sort of like too much to be able to manipulate or to handle. For the purposes of survival, we can't use all of reality as one. We need to break reality down into pieces to construct little minor relative truths that we can use those to manipulate reality how we want. And this is ultimately why most people don't really focus on absolute truth, and they never find it, is because how's it going to help me? Because my whole life is concerned about this little local corner of the universe that I live in, my little local truths. That's all I care about. That's all I need to know in order to survive in my little small way. But what if the small, narrow way in which you've been living life becomes unsatisfying to you? What if you want to live a bigger life? Well, in that case, you got to expand your perspective more towards the absolute. See, from the absolute point of view, you can become enlightened right now, for example. But from the relative point of view, you need to do lots of practice. From the absolute point of view, Maslow's hierarchy of needs doesn't matter at all. Sex doesn't really matter. Money doesn't really matter. Self-esteem doesn't really matter. Creativity doesn't really matter. Business success doesn't matter. Your social status doesn't matter. None of that matters from the absolute point of view. But from the relative point of view that most of you are at, that stuff matters a lot, and it's holding you back from awakening. And in practice, for most humans to awaken, they need to move very high up Maslow's hierarchy of needs. See my episode called Using Maslow's Hierarchy of Needs to Self-Actualize. It's an oldie but a goodie, where I talk about that. That's one of the most practical and effective relative ways of awakening, is just satisfy those basic needs that you have, fill the holes in your pyramid, which looks like a piece of Swiss cheese. Fulfill your sexual needs, get your financial needs met, get your self-esteem in order, get your social life in order. Once you got all those things in order, then awakening will become much easier, because you're not going to be desperate and needy for all those other lower things. You will have experienced them, you will have noticed the dissatisfaction with all those things, the insufficiency of all of them, and then you will be ready to move on and transcend. But if you're struggling your whole life for sex and money and food, what transcendence can there really be? Now, this is not an absolute rule. You can always awaken, even if you are poor and sexually starved and hungry. You can still awaken, and there are plenty of yogis and so forth and ascetics in India who do so every year. But that's not a path that most normies will be able to follow and succeed in. And lastly, let me conclude with why the absolute is important. You might be wondering, like, Leo, why spend so much time talking about it? What's it going to do for me? Well, that's already the wrong frame, but I know where you're coming from, so here's some of the stuff it'll kind of do for you. First of all, it will be the most important experience of your life. There cannot be a more important life experience than coming in contact with absolute truth, because it's the highest. It's absolutely true. Secondly, it recontextualizes your whole life. See my episode, Understanding Recontextualization. It radically recontextualizes your whole life and many areas of life, including relationships, business, money, your own self-image, how you relate to yourself, your own shadow, your health, your career, children, love. Like, it's going to recontextualize so much stuff. Science, what you think science is, society and culture, all this will be radically recontextualized. And it'll have significant practical consequences. It won't just be theory. There will be practical consequences. It eliminates fear, hatred, and suffering. Coming into contact with the absolute defangs relative problems by putting them into proper perspective. And virtually all of human problems are simply a lack of perspective. It also cuts through human bullshit. There's so much human bullshit in our culture, and it's very difficult to break free of it until you access and ground yourself in something that's outside of human invention, which is the absolute. It's really good for that. You don't even understand how much this human bullshit bogs you down until you've escaped it, at least for a little while, and basked in the pureness and honesty of the absolute. Also, the absolute is the only ultimate source of true happiness. True happiness is the result of spiritual connection to the absolute. So the more connected you are to the absolute, the happier you're going to be. And the less connected you are, the more miserable and depressed you're going to be, no matter what other external material conditions you set up for yourself in life, whether sexually, financially, recreationally, or whatever. So if you feel like you're succeeding a lot in life materially, and you have a big house and a big nice family, and you got you got plenty of sex, and you got good fast cars, and you got good food, and you travel all over the world, and you're doing great in business, and then but you feel like still something is missing in your life, and it feels like no matter how hard you work, you're just spinning your wheels, and being happier seems to get harder and harder, not easier and easier. Well, now it's time for you to turn your eyes towards the absolute. That's what you're missing. Also, the absolute just happens to be the answer to all of life's questions. At least all the most important ones. Do you really want to understand what life is and why it is and how it is? Then you need the absolute for that. It also answers a majority of the profound scientific questions. You really want to do quality science? You really want to understand what science is? You need access to the absolute for that. It's also just profoundly beautiful. There's nothing more beautiful than the absolute. So if you're a person who appreciates beauty within art, within music, within film, within games, within life, within nature, within people, all that beauty, where do you think it came from? It's the absolute, manifesting as those things. Life really only starts to make sense after discovering the absolute. And that's perhaps one of the most fulfilling things that the absolute will give you, is it gives you a sort of a calm, because you're no longer like this pinball bouncing around in the pinball machine of life, being pushed hither and thither by others, reacting to others, being confused by what's going on and what's happening to you and whether this is right or that is wrong. And you're just bouncing around constantly. This is how most people's lives are like. Discovering the absolute it grounds you, it mellows you out, it helps you become non-reactive. It gives you a nice, very healthy foundation upon which then you can build a healthy life. And there's more benefits, but we'll keep it short. That should be enough to entice you. All right, that's it. I hope now you understand the difference. I hope now between relative and absolute. I hope now that you're not going to make these conflations, both as a newbie and also as an advanced practitioner once you get there. And I hope your mind is now open to the possibility of the absolute. And then the next step after that is actually doing it, actualizing it. All right, that's it. I'm done here. Please click that like button for me. Don't forget, and come check out Actualized.org. That's my website. On my website, you will find resources that will help you with this whole process. It'll make things clear. You could find my book review list, over 200 of some of the best books that I've read, unique books that you won't find elsewhere on the internet. And these books are really required reading material if you're going to get serious into this work. Even though my work is deep and broad, it's not enough just to listen to my content. You also have to read the books. And that will give you at least at the beginning, a sense of validation. Because see, in practice as a newbie, you need some validation of these ideas. You can't just hear them from me. You should hear them from other masters and teachers who will sort of triangulate with what I'm saying and then corroborate it. And then this gives you more confidence in it until you can go out and actually practice it and actualize some of the stuff. And then when you do, then you won't need the books. You won't need the validation of me or anybody else. You'll be on your own. But before you get on your own, you need a little bit of training wheels, and that's what the book list offers you. You can also find the Life Purpose course, over 25 hours of fresh, exclusive content that's different from the free content that I release, specifically about motivating yourself for the rest of your life, finding your life purpose and passion. Very powerful course. I get a lot of very good testimonials almost on a weekly basis from people who've finished that course. You can also find other resources like my blog, where I'm posting new stuff and sharing links and videos. You can come to the forum and ask questions, where I answer questions. Other smart people on the forum answer questions. Come get help there if you have someplace that you're stuck with your journey at. What else? You can support me if you'd like at patreon.com/actualized. I appreciate any donations that you offer to me. Helps me stay financially independent so that I'm not corrupted by advertisers. And you can check out my second channel called Actualized Clips for shorter snippets of my main videos. that are done by a good editor of mine. So that is that. Make sure you make use of those resources, and more resources will come in the future. I plan to release new courses and other things that I'm working on. It's just taken me longer than anticipated because of certain health issues I've been struggling with recently and working on. And the last thing I want to say is this, is that what Actualized.org really is, from a high level, is it is religion. If religion was modernized with the 21st century, brought up to speed with the 21st century, and if it was free of most corruption, then you would have Actualized.org. And if it was sort of taught at a very sophisticated, complex level. But most religion is thousands of years old, very, very out of date. They use the wrong metaphors. You can't relate to them very well. It's cognitively not complex enough for really learning this material. And it's also full of deep corruption and devilry. And that's the problem with most modern religion. And because of this, religion has gotten a bad rap and a negative stigma. So I even almost hesitate to say that Actualized.org is like a religion, because people get the wrong idea about it. But really, the word religion is also a relative word. Religion can happen at different levels of spiritual, moral, and cognitive development. So religion, when it happens at spiral dynamic stage blue, is not a very good thing. Religion, when it happens at stage yellow or turquoise, is a very, very different beast. Now, even though I say, free of corruption, it doesn't mean Actualized.org is completely free of corruption. I can still be corrupt. I still am corrupt in certain ways. As long as you're a human, as long as you're finite, you're always going to be corrupt in some way or another. So that's basically inescapable. So it's really not a question of whether you're free of corruption or not. It's a question of what degree of corruption do you have? And I consider modern Orthodox religions to be quite corrupt. Whereas compared to what I'm teaching, there are still corruptions in what I teach, just because I'm human, as well as something more. But I'm also in a very fortunate position that I'm financially independent and pretty well off, at least for now. And so because of this, even though there are sort of financial pressures upon me here and there, I could always want to earn more money and stuff and water down my teachings. But actually what I'm noticing is that as I'm developing myself and becoming more conscious, that's becoming less of an influence on me. And so I actually feel my teachings are getting more pure, more authentic, less corrupt. But, there can still be corruptions here or there, so don't hold me to some sort of perfect standard. And the way that you overcome that problem of any corruptions in my teachings is by validating these things for yourself in your direct experience. And then my own personal limitations and corruptions won't so much affect you and be a problem. Because, hey, I got news for you. No matter who you're learning this stuff from, they're always going to have their spin on it, their own biases. They're always going to have some financial pressure placed upon them. There's always going to be some opportunity for corruption, and sometimes it can be severe. So do be mindful of that. And because of this, you shouldn't just blindly trust any spiritual teacher. And the best spiritual teachers will tell you, don't believe me, go out and test this stuff for yourself. And only if it's true for you, should you follow it and pursue it. And if it's not, then go follow something else. And that's what keeps you safe.